Welcome. For those of you who don't know the Wandle Industrial Museum, we are based in the Vestry Hall Annex in Mitcham on London Road on the Lower Green, which is opposite the cricket green, which of course houses the oldest continuous cricket club in the world. Today though, however, we're going to talk about the Wandle, and we're going to look at the sources and the flow of the river of the Wandle. We're going to talk about the industries and some of the things that went on along the Wandle. We're going to look at some of the buildings that are there, particularly within the Merton, London Borough of Merton. And I'm also going to talk about some of the well-known people that we have along the river. Now, this is a bit of a small map. The river itself is 12 miles long, approximately. It has two main sources. And those sources are, in fact, here at Carl Shorten Park and also in Croydon, though you'll see that I'm not actually touching the areas that we now can see the river in. That's at Wadden Ponds and Wandle Park in Croydon. The river flows through Beddington Park, up through Hackbridge, along into Ravensbury Park and past Mitcham Bridge, up into Malden Hall Park, which I'm sure you're familiar with, up into Collier's Wood, continuing its journey up into the west side of Wimbledon, up in through Somers Town, along Garrett Lane, roughly, up into it, joins the Thames at Wandsworth. And it falls 150 feet over its length, which actually makes it very fast flowing. And it was this that actually attracted much of the mill workers and much of the industry to the river. Certainly in the early 1800s, the river itself was actually known as the hardest working river for its size in the world, which is quite something. Now, in terms of its sources, the actual river itself from the Croydon end actually flows out of the North Downs, and it comes down between the Causden and the Caterham Bournes. Those two join at this point, the Swan and Sugarloaf Hotel, which is now, unfortunately, a Tesco's Express, as is a want of a lot of the pubs. But it joins there and it actually flows through Croydon. Unfortunately, of course, within Croydon, it is very much underground these days. And one of the few places, one of the last places you saw it when it left and come out of Croydon was in fact at Croydon Old Palace. And this is a sketch of the river there at Croydon Old Palace, which is now Whitgift School. And in fact, there was works going on here, even though the palace was used by Henry VIII. And he didn't like coming to Croydon. He always said that he felt ill after he visited Croydon. Anyway, it was actually turned into works, and there was a number of textile works that actually existed here during a period during the 17 and 1800s. But this is the Carl Shorten end, and this very rarely actually fills with water now. So a lot of people actually think the Carl Shorten end of the River Wandle is in fact Carl Shorten Ponds. It isn't the case. It's actually out of the grotto, which you can just see in the background on the left-hand picture. And this is after heavy rainfall. It doesn't very often fill up these days, but the grotto itself is a spring. The water levels within the River Wandle itself are probably about under 50% of what they were 150 years ago. So it gives you a real sense. And I'll tell you a little story about that when we get further on. In terms of the hog pits, which is in Croydon, which a lot of people question, Carl Shorten, sorry, a lot of people question why the hog pit. Well, it does fill up with water, and in fact, what it used to do is actually another channel that goes down to Carl Shorten High Street that actually served a mill that was in Carl Shorten High Street. But there's also other places and also flow into the River Wandle. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Wimbledon Park, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the lake But if you actually notice on the right-hand side there, this is the River Wandle, travelling up here. This is obviously the lake, but look at this channel flowing from the lake down into the River Wandle. And you'll also notice that there's channels going out the other way on the lake, which does bear the question that this is up onto Wimbledon Common. This is the one serving the lake from Wimbledon Common. Of course, the other side of the common is Beverley Brook. It's quite possible that water from the Wimbledon Common serves both. And this is where it looks like this is where it comes out in Wimbledon. It comes out opposite near Ravensbury Terrace. And you can see the river there. To get down there, this is as much as you see from the lake, because it's all culverted. One of our volunteers actually followed it through, listening at manhole covers and actually sort of listening to it and hearing it from there. So that's the actual flow, and that's the river itself. It is possible to walk all of it. It is about 12 miles. You don't have to do it all in one go. You can follow what they call the Wandle Trail. And you can go from either direction. If you ride a bike, great, you can take your bike and go along there. And it's quite accessible. It's very flat as well, so there's not a lot of hilly bits, and it is quite a pleasurable walk. But moving on now and looking at the industries, and I said to you earlier that at one time it was the most industrial river in the world. And you can see that from some of the industries here. You've got snuff and tobacco, you've got iron and copper work, got gunpowder, which I will mention in a little while. Short-lived, but very important at the time. Oil is linseed oil, basically. Leather work, we'll talk a bit more about that. And of course, the textile industry and the calico printing, which probably is what the river is best known for. But you can see it goes right back to Roman times with corn and flour as well. And moving on, this would have been a site at Burton Abbey that you would have seen along about 100 years ago. So not that far away, perhaps 150 years ago. This actually shows bleaching fields. Now, bleaching fields were actually associated with the textile industry. During the 1700s, and certainly to the middle of the 1800s, we imported raw calico from India. And there's a lot of issues around Parliament petitions, etc., around the input of printed textiles, etc. at the time. But we had to bleach the calico fields. Now, if any of you know Dean City Farm as such, that was a large bleaching field. And this, in fact, even though we say Burton Abbey, this is actually the bleaching fields where Dean City Farm now are. So the calico itself had to be dipped in water channels, laid out in the sun, and it took about 2 to 3 weeks to actually make that raw calico go white. And we had a number of these. There was ones at the Willows in Mitcham, Burton Abbey, and also at Fitzbridge as well. Now later on, the calico bleaching fields actually got turned into watercress, and this is, excuse me, this is opposite Christchurch in Collier's Wood. And there in front of you is, in fact, watercress farms. And watercress was grown in those channels later on. But of course, we had a number of calico printers, probably the best known, William Morris, that I'll talk about a bit later. But this is his pattern celebrating the River Wandle. Very nice, one of my favourite patterns of William Morris. A lot of people say, why isn't it in blue? There is a blue version of it. My colleagues at the museum liken this to a barber's pole, but yeah, I think it's a very nice pattern anyway. Now, in terms of gunpowder that I mentioned earlier, gunpowder production along the River Wandle took place around the time of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. We in fact fought 4 wars. There was an earlier one as well that we fought. And gunpowder was very successful. There was a gentleman named Joshua Dewey, who was very successful down at Hackbridge, producing gunpowder, and he became the prime supplier of gunpowder to the Admiralty. There was a bit of a problem early on when he was actually working at Wandsworth, where they found that 70% of the gunpowder didn't actually fire. And I sort of liken that to the story. Well, hang on a minute, didn't the Dutch come up the Medway and they destroy the English fleet? Well, the reason they destroyed the English fleet had nothing to do with the gunpowder, unfortunately. It was because most of the ships that the British fleet, English fleet had were in fact dry dock. So that's a little bit on the gunpowder side. The one industry that was missing was brewing. This is Youngs and Wandsworth, probably the most famous of the brewers along the River Wandle, but there was brewers also at Mitcham and also at Wallington as well. But Youngs was the most famous. Very interesting when you look at the brewing industry today, the fact that we had small brewers all the way along the river. At Croydon, for instance, we had Page and Overton that were quite well known. We had the Mitcham Brewery that I mentioned. All these little breweries actually started being bought up by these bigger boys. And Youngs was an example of that. But of course, today, in terms of brewing industry, it's going back the other way, and we're starting to see lots of micro breweries actually set up. In terms of the Youngs site at Wandsworth, that's now been redeveloped. Saying it's been redeveloped and turned into housing, it does still have a brewery there. And for many years after Youngs closed in 1996, I think that's the right date, there was a gentleman called John Hatch who was running a microbrewery out of the stable block. And he now works for a company called Sam Brooks, who in fact have opened a museum within the complex of the former Ram Brewery. On the corner in the Ram Inn, which is the pub, there's another brewers called the Sly Beast Brewing, who make a selection of beers that reflect the industrial history around the brewery itself and along the River Wandle. Now, probably one of the places that you may well have come across and you may well know is actually Connolly's. Now, I found out the other day, in fact, this picture was actually taken in 1935. Now, Connolly's are actually on the north side of Merton High Street, which, if you look at some maps, will say was New Wimbledon. But you can just see Connolly's here and how vast the Connolly's works were. Now, Connolly's themselves were leather people. Now, the mills here have actually, a mill here on this site actually dates all the way back to the Domesday Survey. And there in fact was 13 mills along the River Wandle that are listed within the Domesday Survey of 1086. Today, there's only one building left there, and I'll show you that in a moment. But Connolly's, if any of you ever owned a Daimler, a Jaguar, or any of those cars, or any of you ever been to the House of Commons or the House of Lords, you're actually sitting on leather that was supplied by Connolly's in Collier's Wood. They also supplied a lot of the liners as well, and the ocean liners that go across the Atlantic in particular. The QE2, for instance, had Connolly's leather on it, within it. But certainly, if you ever go to the House of Lords, House of Commons, sit on the chairs there, you're sitting on Connolly's leather. Sadly, today, this is the only remaining building of Connolly's, altered slightly from the original building and also cut in half, believe it or not. But now been turned into flats, which isn't uncommon. So that's the only building left. We also have, which is potentially the new home for the Wandle Industrial Museum. We're in a temporary home at the moment that we've been in since 1992. Don't ask the question, it's all to do with the developer and the council and nothing to do with the museum. But this is Ravensbury Mill. which is the north end of Ravensbury Park. This was in fact snuff production, which is very, very well known. It was run by a company called Rutters. It was later taken over the mill by Whiteley's, and they were a rubber producing company. It then fell into disrepair, but has since been turned into housing. And this is what it looks like today. But just in this area here, behind these doors, are two water wheels. Obviously, the only water wheel that we've got that still works on the River Wandle today is at Burton Mills. But there are a number of water wheels still left. And these two here, Ravensbury Mill, are housed, as I say, inside the building. And that wasn't uncommon. The biggest water wheel on the River Wandle, in fact, was at Wimbledon Mill, Copper Mill Lane, just off of Plough Lane. That was housed in a three-storey building. It was said to be the second largest wheel in the country as well. So not uncommon. But this should be familiar. This is the Malden Horse Stuff Mills. And of course, that had two water wheels. Stuff mills actually closed down in 1922 following a strike. And I'll say that a little bit more about that later on. Of course, Malden Hill Park itself was owned by the Hatfield family. Before that, previously, it was owned by the Garth family. Now, the wheels were allowed to go into disrepair. But the National Trust, to their credit, they decided to put a new wheel in. And so the intention was to, in fact, replace both wheels. But they found when they put this one in, it didn't actually reach the water. It's actually 2-3 foot short of the water, which gives you an indication of how the water levels have actually dropped over the years. Just behind this, in fact, is what they call a mill pond. And it wasn't uncommon when water levels were actually low to actually have mill ponds where water was actually stored and then released to actually drive the water wheels. Moving on, this is Merton Abbey Mills, which was Liberty Print Works. In fact, the print works here and the calico works had actually existed since 1752. The buildings that are actually exist on the site now were actually built by Liberty when they took over the site in 1904 from the Littlers family. The Littlers family actually did work for Liberties, but old age and no longer having a line of succession for the Littlers family, they sold out to Liberties. And Liberties at that time actually decided over the next few years to actually start knocking most of the buildings down and replacing them. The only one that really survived is what is called the Colour House, which is now the Colour House Theatre. The building in the middle there is called the Long Shop. And you'll notice that it's got lovely curved windows and this lovely entrance to it. Sadly, all of that was gone, which it caused a bit of an issue for a number of people. And it now looks like this. It still keep the curved windows at the end, but it's now been turned into a number of individual units. Makes commercial sense to the owners of the site, but unfortunately, as far as we're concerned, it's destroyed the character of it. But that was known as a long shop. That's where a lot of the printing actually took place of that calico that I showed you earlier. And it was done by using wooden blocks. And you saw that picture of the Wandle by William Morris. That would have taken a number of different blocks to actually print. And each colour on that pattern required its own block to print as well. Other buildings we have associated with Merton as well is here at Mitcham Bridge. Of course, Mitcham Bridge is in the news at the moment because it's currently being rebuilt following a collapse 2 years ago. But this is a scene from 1905. And in fact, you can see two mill buildings, very busy site. Here we have what was is known as Grove Mill. Over here we have Crown Mill. And here we have what is the workers' cottages, now better known as the fisheries cottages. Grove Mill, this version of it, actually had a fire in 1907. Now, fires in mills weren't uncommon. In fact, they were very common, especially with those with a wooden structure, which most of the mills were made of. But today, Grove Mill was rebuilt, and once again, it's housing. The fisheries cottages, as they are now known, which were the mill workers' cottages, they've also been repaired. They were going to be demolished at one point in the 1980s, but they were saved. They are historically important, and they are now living accommodation and quite nice, living right on the banks of the river. In terms of the other mill on the site, the Crown Mill, that was burnt down in 1965, completely flattened. The building has been built there in the style of the old mill, which of course now provides accommodation for people there. Moving on, we move and look at probably something that some people know a lot about and some people don't. This is Burton Priory. Moranton Way runs right over the Priory. The Saviour Centre, the Marks and Spencers and Sainsbury's was also built on the site. But in fact, Burton Priory was larger than Westminster Abbey. It was the third richest priory in the country, and certainly the richest in Surrey. But of course, it fell into the hands of Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII, and as a result, it was knocked down. Its real mark on history is the statues of Merton, which underpin the Magna Carta. Burton Priory is also home to the first parliament in the country as well. The only bit you can actually see this day is this bit in the middle here, which is the chapter house. The chapter house does sit under the road, but you can access it, and it's open every Sunday from 11 till 5, if memory serves me right, but every Sunday during the summer between 11 and 5. And this is what you will see. You will see the remains. There are some of the graves down there. There was over 300 graves were exhumed on the site. And it is a smashing bit of history. In terms of the stone, that was taken away, and much of that went to actually build Nonsuch Palace at Cunnington. And of course, that then fell into disrepair. That was sold off again. So Burton Priory stone could be anywhere in the world. What I'd like to do now is move on and look at some of the people that we have. We're going to look at a couple of Williams first. But the first one I'm going to look at is William Kilburn. William Kilburn was an Irishman. He came over to this country and got involved with a William Curtis, who in fact produced a book called Flora Londinius, which actually showed all the flora that actually goes around London. Now, he produced a number of different patterns. These can all be seen in the V&A, but you do have to ask to see them rather than they are on display. But William Kilburn himself had a number of issues with copyright. And he did go to Parliament about copyright. That's because his patterns used to be stolen by a warehouseman up in the East End, where his materials was, and he sold them to a company in Bury in Lancashire, who then produced cheaper versions of it. Of course, Bury being part of Greater Manchester, which is still seen today as the counterfeit capital of the UK. But that was William Kilburn. The nice little touch about William Kilburn, when he first started working out in Dublin, he actually used to sell his sketches and all that, so he could buy a pony so he could then go and visit his mother and father on a Sunday, which I think is a lovely little story for that man. The other William, of course, is William Morris. What can you say about William Morris? William Morris just about did everything in his short life that you could possibly do. Social activist, poet, writer, designer, etc., etc. Certainly his association with the River Wandle started when he took over the Merton Abbey works. Now, don't confuse the Merton Abbey works with where Liberties were in Merton Abbey Mills. Morris wasn't on that site. He was in fact in a works that are on the bend by Merton High Street. One side is covered by the Sabre Centre, and one side is covered by Trellis House, the care home. So that's where William Morris was. But of course, well famous, he had other people he worked with, such as Edward Burne-Jones and also William de Morgan as well, who was a good friend of him, who actually introduced him to the works here at Collier's Wood. But he took over that works in about 1884, and that works actually survived until 1940, when the company Morris and Co. actually shut down at that time. But also the site got bombed, and it got bombed out. It was then taken over by the new Merton board mills, and some of you probably remember the board mills in Collier's Wood as well. Another family which automatically wouldn't associate with the Wandle is the Rotney family, certainly associated with Wimbledon, and certainly Daniel Rotney, who is rumoured to have been found on Wimbledon Common by gypsies or abandoned by gypsies, actually lived in a house where the Hand in Hand and the Crooked Billet are now, up on Wimbledon Common. But the Rotney family actually started out as millers, and certainly they were involved in a number of the mills along the River Wandle, certainly at Wadden Mills, Hackbridge, Mitcham as well. And they also owned a lot of land in Mitcham, and they also certainly ran a farm in Mitcham as well. And if you visit Mitcham, you've got New Barnes Road, which is associated with the farm they had there, and also Watney Avenue in Mitcham that goes across Mitcham Common. So a long association there, but certainly they moved into Wandsworth, had a hand in 3 of the mills at Wandsworth, the lower, upper and middle mills. And they also had a hand in what was the Surrey Iron Railway, which is the first railway by an Act of Parliament as well, which ran from Wandsworth all the way down to Croydon and then joined the Croydon, Godstone and Merson Railway as well, to carry on down to quarries in Merston. They really got involved in brewing when James Watney actually took over and started working with Henry Wells in the Stag Brewery in Pimlico. So, you know, the Watney family really are millers rather than a brewing factory, though brewing family, but of course we're well known for our Party Sevens and our Watney's Red Barrel. And someone else that is associated with the Wandle, of course, is this gentleman, Lord Nelson, and his property at Merton Place here. Now, Merton Place was just off of Merton High Street, and the area, in fact, expanded over, the estate expanded over to both sides of Merton High Street. It was quite a large estate. Of course, the house went into disrepair and was pulled down. The water you actually see was known as the Little Nile, which is a name given to it by Lady Hamilton in recognition of Nelson's victory on the River Nile. And certainly the water there was actually taken from the River Wandle and would have created that as well. Now, the last gentleman we're going to look at is this gentleman, Edward Hatfield, part member, the last of the Hatfield family. Now, the Hatfields, can trace them back really to around the 1850s, 1860s, when they moved to Merton. their history before that actually seems a bit sketchy, though they do seem to have come from Norwich. And they do seem to have been a banking family, but they're well known for their stuff productions. And certainly they had a factory at the Minions, just off Whitechapel Road up at the East End of London. And of course, they, as part of a company known as Taddy & Co. Now, the boys are amongst you and probably the girls as well. May well remember the cigarette cards that you used to get. Now, Taddy & Co. produced lots of those cards to do with the snuff and the tobacco they actually produce. And they do sell for a lot of money as well. They are still well sought after today. But of course, they had the two snuff mills there. Now, whether Hatfield is a hero or a villain in terms of the family is questionable. The reason I say that, the decision to close the snuff mills was actually his. He made that in 1922. Now, he actually looked after his workers, and his workers down here were actually much better paid and much better looked after than those in other snuff factories. But following a strike by those in the East End, he made the decision to close it down. Now, to his credit, he did actually find jobs for other workers on the estate. Now, the other reason I say that they're heroes or villains is because of Wandle Villa. Now, Wandle Villa is actually on Fitzbridge Road. Now, it did have with it calico works. Now, but when the Hatfield family actually took over the house, they actually stopped calico production and actually pulled the works down. And of course, that meant a number of people there actually were then out of work. It's not known what happened to them. But when the family actually moved from Wandle Villa, where they actually first lived, they moved into Malden Cottage. Malden Cottage, which is the former Malden Registry Office, proved too small for them. So they moved into Malden Hall. Of course, these days, Malden Hall is in fact a wedding venue. But when the last Hatfield that we've seen was left, he decided that Malden Hall was too large for him, and he moved back into Malden Cottage. And he lived there until the end of his life in 1940. Now, the interesting fact about him is he didn't like any electricity, didn't like anything modern, so he never had electricity there. He was still known to actually go round on horse and carriage, which is quite interesting, I think, especially given that the stable block has now been converted. But that's where he lived, and he lived there. And of course, in 1940, when he died, he bequeathed Malden Hall to Malden Hall Park to the National Trust. Now that brings to the end this part of the talk. If anybody has any questions, I'm sure Rachel will unmute you all, and you can ask any questions you like. I'm now going to stop sharing as such. But I will say something. If you want to listen to any talks, we do have a number of talks on our YouTube channel. And certainly there's a lot of interesting things on there, and you'll get a lot more information. This is really a whistle-stop tour. In terms of the museum itself, as I say, we're based on the Lower Green down at Mitcham. We are open on a Wednesday from 1 till 4 o'clock, and on a Sunday between 2 and 5. So if you get the opportunity, do pay us a visit, and we look forward to seeing you.